Recently, I finished The Anxious Generation by Dr. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist and author most widely known for co-authoring The Coddling of the American Mind in 2018 that you might recognize. I was so personally impacted by this read and its insight on what growing up with social media does to a child now that we've gone through a generation that we are able to study data from. By this point, we all generally know that blue light before bed is bad and phones can get addictive, but this book is a lot more focused than that, and I want to show the information that I didn't know and you may not know about how monitoring our children's interest into social media is extremely consequential because of the damages we've seen. I really do think that if there was a all required reading for people under 30 or for parents, this book would absolutely be on it, especially in 2025. But not everyone has the time. Not everyone really enjoys reading this type of book especially. So I'm hoping that this makes it more accessible to you with my top 10 takeaways, but also hoping it does inspire you to read the book for yourself because I do think you'll get the most out of it that way. This book is written due to the surge of mental illness in the US, particularly among Gen Z. And as we'll look at, this is also happening in other parts of the world, not just the US. As Haidt looks at what the cause of the surge is, he blames it on the entrance of social media in 2009 through its peak in 2015. And the decline of the type of childhood that preceded it. Essentially, he says that childhood went from being play-based to phone-based, and he's going to outline what the stakes are of this kind of shift and how we can return to giving our kids an environment to thrive and put technology in its place. One defining term that's most important before we jump in is the term Gen Z. When Haidt and me in this video refer to Gen Z, we're not talking about those who wear wide leg jeans or middle part their hair. We're talking about those who had access to social media before or during puberty, which is the key. To Haidt, this is one of the most consequential findings of the great rewiring of childhood, as he calls it, as we'll see later. So with that term defined, let's dive into it. Here are my top 10 takeaways from The Anxious Generation. Number 1, Gen Z is having a mental health crisis due to smartphones and social media, not solely economic events. This conversation is particularly fascinating to me because I've always heard that Gen Z is anxious due to being post-2008 housing crisis or post-9/11, but he argues that individuals do not get depressed or anxious when they face threats as a society, and that these are only contributors to the mental health crisis, not the main proponent. Haidt says, if world events played a role in the current mental health crisis, it's not because world events suddenly got worse around 2012. It's because world events were suddenly being pumped into adolescents' brains through their phones, not as news stories, but as social media posts in which other young people express their emotions about a collapsing world, emotions that are contagious on social media. Anxiety and depression is also rising among teens in Canada and the UK, which is important to the conversation because it means this doesn't just make it a Western problem. So we can't just say that Western world events are what's changing these things. I'm really just briefing over this point, but it's really key that this issue is being found in depth wherever social media and smartphones are given at the age of puberty. Number 2, children need play and risk in order to thrive, and smartphones block experience in these two necessary components of childhood. So Haidt teaches in the book and argues in a specific chapter that children are anti-fragile. So as the immune system needs to be exposed to germs, children need to encounter setbacks and failures. I think of my 1-year-old who keeps eating dirt, but he is the only one in our house who never gets sick. He says that we need to have play that involves risk in order to build resilience and self-confidence. But as we've grown in collective fear as a society, we have lower trust of neighbors. We have begun to worship safety, as he says, as the top priority of parenting. However, children can only learn how to not get hurt in situations where it is possible to get hurt. Haidt reminds us that children need play. This is how they learn to thrive and make mistakes and have low risk impact and attune to other children. So we often think maybe school or daycare is what creates the social ability to thrive in our children, but it is truly play. This is how they gain confidence. He tells us information does not shape a developing brain. Play does. I'll come back to this point at the end to add more of my personal thoughts, but the next takeaway is number 3. Social media influencers and value systems outweigh the influence of a parent at home. Haidt reminds us that childhood is naturally designed to be a slow give and take learning process, and all the moms said amen. But when social media enters the picture, it acts as a sort of co-parent that is feeding children an entire set of its own value systems and worldviews, which really shouldn't be downplayed. What he's saying is that parenting is no match for social media. It's overriding your influence because of its ability to pump ideology into the child at an incomparable rate that you can teach them. And you can only hope and pray that it's the same ideologies and values that you hold in your house. In his language, both safetyism, discussed in the last point, and screen time serve as experience blockers that keep them from the apprenticeship model of parenting in childhood and the attunement with other children. When we remove social media out of the hands that are too young to wield it, we provide them with a more natural maturation process where we as the parent shape core values and group identity. If we choose not to, we should not be surprised if our children develop competing ideologies than the ones we desire them to have.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening up to this point. In post, I realized I wanted to add a disclaimer that some of the content in the next few sections will come with some sensitive topics. So if you have little ears around, I recommend discretion with listening out loud. Let's jump back in.
Number 4. We have a tendency to overprotect children in the real world and underprotect children in the online world. This is one of the main themes of the book, where essentially Haidt sees this downtick in risky play, where children work together and build resilience, and an uptick of unsupervised full access to the entire internet and its database. This decision, Haidt argues, is the wrong order of protection. One of the arguments for reordering these priorities is that in the real world, when children make mistakes, they have proportionate consequences and learn that from failure. If you misstep on the merry-go-round, you fall off and get hurt. When you try again, you work together with other kids and build confidence that you learned how to do it. On the other hand, online mistakes have disproportionate consequences. If you're 5 years old and playing a game on your parents' iPad, you run up their Apple Play Store for $500 buying virtual coins. Or if you text a picture to a boy or girl when you're 12, it will stay online forever and possibly be used against you. I personally appreciate Haidt introducing me to this paradox. And I'm also thankful that he addressed a huge concern that initially had me unsure if I agreed with him. And that is, what about letting our children go out independently outside or in spaces where they could become victims of human trafficking or sexual predation? This is a very valid concern, but he handles this fear carefully, where he reminds us that the main threat of sexual predation remains online. This is something I personally know to be true from working with the human trafficking prevention nonprofit in San Antonio. They spend most of their time making parents and students aware that the major threats remain online, and trafficking is not how we might see it in the movies with someone rolling up with a van. It is truly being leveraged on social media and these dark online spaces. And though you can't trust everyone in the real world, Haidt thinks we would benefit as a society to find some middle ground for letting children experience age-appropriate independence. He also lays out why the entrance of social media, specifically at puberty, is a problem. He uses the analogy of writing your name in cement. If you write your name in freshly poured cement, it's going to disappear eventually, and if you write your name in hardened cement, it won't work. But if you catch it at the right time in the drying process, your name will remain forever. This is puberty for a human child. He says, puberty is therefore a period when we should be particularly concerned about what our children are experiencing. It's often around this time that parents will let up on boundaries for screen time, but it is actually one of the most crucial periods for allowing our kids to grow without its influence. This is why one of the reforms that Haidt will advocate for later in the book is 14 being the minimum age for receiving a smartphone and 16 being the minimum age for entering social media, which might seem like a lot to us, but when we look at the data, it's really heavy to consider. Number 5, many of the issues we are medicating teenagers and young adults for are direct harms from being a frequent user of social media. I'm going to make a point here that He doesn't really talk about us medicating teenagers. This is actually my personal thought and my personal argument, but he does talk about the direct harms of social media. So I'm using a lot of my personal experience here, not as much of Haidt's data, but let's outline it. So I won't spend a ton of time expanding on what he says in the book because, again, this is the part of the book that we generally know about smartphones. But through my personal experience, I've heard and seen a lot of my young friends, maybe my peers or those a little bit younger than me, and even teenagers who are being prescribed a lot of meds for depression, anxiety, and ADHD specifically, but they aren't asked first about screen habits. However, the 4 foundational harms that smartphones and social media cause, as Haidt says, are social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. The first thought is that though medication can absolutely help subside extreme symptoms, we still have to help young people get to the root of their problem. I don't want to get all big pharma speculative in this video, but if the data is showing how impactful smartphones are to Gen Z, why are we not starting here in the healthcare space or even in our own homes? It's also really helpful to know that if a young person is struggling with a chronic anxiety and depression issue, there absolutely matters that they can take into their own hands. They don't have to wait for big pharma or parents or life circumstances to change this. And that is a really good thing. Obviously, there may be other factors other than smartphones, but I think that if you're under 30, this is a great place where you should start. Personally, I've witnessed a young friend who was 20 years old, and she got diagnosed with all of it: anxiety, ADHD, depression at one point. But she started working out, running, limiting screen time as her way of regulating, and it has actually worked for her to where she doesn't have to take this medication, or at least as heavily as she used to. This is a personal ad here, but we've really got to help our Gen Z friends see this. And those of us that are Gen Z, we need to be aware so that we can really look at our screen time and see, am I being affected by this? And the answer is probably yes, if we are heavy users of it. Number 6, social media is extremely more harmful for girls than it is for boys. This point is extremely fascinating to me personally. When Haidt discusses this claim in chapter 6, it is almost solely backed by research. This is not his personal claim, and it's not a debate, and it's not a small finding. There is overwhelming data that social media is wrecking the lives of females, particularly young females. If you are a woman or a girl, you should really dial in for this section because I think it's really important for us. Haidt says girls who say they spend 5 or more hours each weekday, check your screen time, it's probably about that much, on social media are 3 times as likely to be depressed as those who report no social media time. He says that American high school students spend an average of 40 hours a week on social media. As he reminds us, this is a full-time job and a full-time high school student. And they are way beyond this threshold for if they are going to be 3 times as likely to be depressed. The first core reason why social media is more harmful for girls is that girls are more affected by social comparison and perfectionism. For adolescent girls, we see this have an extreme impact when it comes to beauty standards. We all kind of know this, but it's really important to dial into. This is what Haidt tells us is socially prescribed perfectionism. This is not the same as self-prescribed perfectionism. Something I found really interesting here is I've personally noticed more and more that many of the young women I know personally, and I hear of them maybe having really intense anxiety and depression, even admitting themselves into mental hospitals and facilities, are really high achieving girls. These girls are the ones with straight A's, great behavior, naturally attract lots of friends, beautiful. So what is going on? I think, this is my personal read into this specific problem that Haidt brings up, is that if we have socially prescribed anxiety on social media, and then we have self-prescribed social anxiety, we're naturally driven, then we're going to crash and burn at some point because we can never keep up with both. If you are watching this and you're a woman and you consider yourself high achieving, driven, or perfectionist, if any of that sounds like you should heavily question your personal social media use and curate it as much as possible. You are putting yourself on both sides of your perfectionism and the world's perfectionism, and it's going to get too hard to bear at some point, especially if you still have a developing mind and you're trying to grow your own identity. It's important to add here that Haidt teaches us that the frequent reminders girls give each other that social media is not reality are likely to only have a limited effect because the part of the brain that is doing the comparisons to others is not governed by the part of the brain that knows consciously that they are seeing only edited highlight reels. You may know that you're not supposed to live up to beauty standards and can't, but your brain is getting depressed about it anyways because it's searching and looking at these photos to build mental maps of femininity for you to mirror. So your brain is working against you even though you know logically that you're not supposed to compare yourself. The second reason girls are more vulnerable is because girls' aggression is more relational. Essentially, this means that because girls have a physiological difference from men to be wired more communally, the worst thing a young girl can experience is social death. Haidt says, for depressed and ostracized teens, physical death offers the end of pain, whereas social death is a living hell. When girls attack each other, which they often do, they use the engine of social media to deconstruct a girl's social standing, and this can be incredibly damaging. Insert a lot of the conversations we've seen about cyberbullying and its effect on girls and some of the movies that have been made. This is not just a caricature movie issue. This is a real problem that is more prominent for women. The third reason girls are more vulnerable is that girls cause contagion of emotions and disorders. Haidt summarizes the findings that when a woman becomes depressed, it increased the odds of depression in her close friends, male and female, by 142%. This is fascinating. What this means is if you know a girl who is depressed or anxious and you're close to her, whether you are male or female, your odds of depression are increased by 142%. I think this is the blessing and curse of being a woman, because the blessing is that we can have the adverse effect with joy. But Haidt reminds us that in human psychology, unfortunately, the bad emotions are more contagious than the good ones, and that's just a psychological fact. So when girls get on social media and share their feelings, they create a sort of contagion for anyone who uses it, male and female. Another way to say this is girls are running social media. This not only happens with anxiety and depression, but also with psychological disorders. Trauma triggers Tourette's, autism, dissociative identity disorder. These are all being overwhelmingly claimed by Gen Z. There's an uptick in all of these psychological spaces where people are claiming to have these disorders, and after the tests and the findings, a lot of them do not, but they are catching a sort of social contagion. Haidt also applies this to gender dysphoria as well, which we've all seen that in the more recent years, identifying as LGBTQ is sort of a social contagion, not just an individual truly believing that this is their place. This has become an almost fad. Lastly, girls are more at risk of being subject to sexual harassment and predation. And this is really important when we're talking about social media. This is something we're privy to, though, that social media is dangerous for young women who are being lured and exploited online. It's important to note that when we are sending a girl under 18 online, she becomes at risk for sexual predation that she often does not know how to navigate. And we have to see that this is very different for boys. This is absolutely happening to boys, and we should not count that out, and we should protect our boys as well. But it is very different for women, especially in the case that girls are at risk of being a target for really any age of male online. When it comes to the impact on boys versus girls engaging things like nude photos or sexting, boys are often rewarded or simply just not reprimanded for being bold enough and engaging in this behavior, and they're often cheered on by their other male peers. Girls will often get a stained reputation in her social circle, which is, if you remember, the worst thing that a girl could have done to her. And so the consequences for boys and girls often look really different socially in their friend space and really different when we're talking about the major impacts. Number 7, the conversation of the smartphone's effect on boys is much more complex. It's important to note here that Haidt's chapter on why social media is harmful for girls is not a speculation. Again, there's overwhelming data supporting that girls' mental health is plummeting when they are on social media. I thought that video games, YouTube, or TikTok would be to boys as much as social media, particularly Instagram, is to girls. But this isn't statistically a reality. So much more of Haidt's conversation on what's happening to boys is an educated speculation because data is not overwhelmingly pointing to one specific thing when we're talking about boys' mental health. Something that data did show to Haidt in his research was that boys showed evidence of pulling away from engagement in the real world long before social media entered the scene. As I read that, I wasn't surprised, as fatherlessness for millennials and older Gen Z is a huge topic of discussion. However, I had never consider the explanations of why. Firstly, when the economy dramatically shifted to the service industry, physical strength from men was less needed. So the workspace environments shifted and required new skills, intelligence, ability to sit still and focus, to communicate openly, and have the ability to listen to people. Sounds like you know where this is going. These skills are much more suited for women. Men have, in a lot of ways, literally been pushed out of the workspace. Many would see this as progressivism, but Haidt does not, which I appreciate. He quotes Richard Reeves, who asserts one of the most prolific truths I've ever heard, and he says, "Floundering men is unlikely to be a world of flourishing women." Secondly, after work environment, Haidt believes strongly that safetyism has affected boys much more than girls because boys need rough play as a way of learning the world and relating to one another. This is where they derive a lot of core identity and purpose. Haidt argues we must allow boys to take risks again, because if they do not engage in risk, they will develop too large a fear of failure to ever even try in multiple different areas of their life. We are unintentionally but surely eliminating the need for risk for boys, especially as technology develops within AI. One of the most consequential spaces we see this for boys is, of course, hardcore pornography. Pornography removes the risk for vulnerability or having to navigate the complexities of relationships with women who require a lot of care and commitment before being sexually active. Haidt even reminds that pornography in magazine form required boys to sneak to the store, find some way to obtain it despite its age restriction, then hide it somewhere in the house. And this is not a pro-pornography conversation, but what we're talking about is now it is so accessible and it is so derogatory that it is forming a whole generation of men to be sedated and to remove risk from their life entirely in some of the most important areas. In tandem with this book, I've been reading Wild at Heart by John Eldredge, and he says that the question that every man asks is, do I have what it takes? And their greatest fear is failure. Unknowingly, as a society, we've been telling them, no, you don't have what it takes. And if you fail forever. This is the case for parents allowing their boys especially to take risks, have rough play, and not allow them to take paths without adversity because it will negatively impact their well-being and their future relationships. This conversation for Haidt is a challenge to boys and men to take both physical, professional, and relational risks. Thirdly, boys become engaged heavily in gaming and social media platforms, cutting them off from meaningful relationships and therefore causing staggering rates of loneliness among boys and men. He says when this happens to men, they are more vulnerable to becoming complete shut-ins, which is where we get our term failure to launch. Haidt shows us that social media, but more specifically gaming, AI, and pornography, is aiding men in remaining at home because all of these things give a false sense of having everything one needs without the risk of social interaction, which brings him back to imploring society and parents to lead boys to take risks. I have to say, I was not expecting this chapter to go as it did, especially when he really dives into video games. Often the rhetoric about video games is that boys waste their life away on them. This is absolutely true of some, but not all. And research is actually showing mixed results with lots of cons and pros of video games, whereas social media is unrelenting in negative data. It is still important to note that 1 in 13 boys fall into the problematic addicted scale, but truly it all comes down to how they use it. Gamers are considered to be in 4 categories: addicted, problematic, engaged, and casual. The goal for boys is to keep them on the lower end of the scale, but not necessarily to eradicate them. To Haidt, what is a glaring issue for boys is lack of friendships and the inability to put down deep roots in real-world communities. And all of these issues, social media, gaming, AI, pornography, all of these things, they just hinder and add more roadblocks to these meaningful relationships. I honestly find this to be way more hopeful than making them unplug video games or things like that, because as a Christian, I believe both of these things are found in their fullest form in the church. So if you are a boy, you're a man watching this, everything you need is found within your local church. And of course, limiting some of these other things that do not require you to have to take the social and relational risks. Which brings me to point number 8. Number 8, Haidt believes that one of social media's greatest impact is the degradation of spirituality, a key component of our humanity. Haidt takes this book in a direction I was not expecting it to go at all. I'm not familiar with his previous publications and research, so I didn't know that he's already written about this, and it's actually one of his specializations is moral psychology. But in chapter 8, Haidt makes a strong case that we are all wasting away as a society for lack of a moral standard. He says that through practicing spirituality, we can shift focus off ourselves and into the world around us, which is the opposite of what social media does to us, which is that it makes us obsessed with ourselves and therefore unable to have a transcendent perspective in order to have hope, joy, and peace. He shares 6 spiritual practices that we should all partake in. And the really cool thing is that as someone who's been attending church for over a decade, I promise that everything he outlines is nothing that your local pastor and your local church is not already talking about. He says we need shared sacredness, which can be translated to the church as gathering on Sunday where we come together, sing, and hear a message. The collective act of worship is bonding and nutritive in a way that is incomparable to anything we can do in the natural. This is, again, something supported by secular research. Secondly, he says we should practice embodiment or gathering. The Apostle Paul would say, do not neglect the gathering. He says there is actually no higher form of embodiment than breaking bread together. This is insane because it completely supports Jesus' ministry and how he was intimate with his disciples and people through eating, and commands us to eat and drink in remembrance of him. The 2 spiritual practices I just named in one. He says that this practice is one thing that the virtual world can never overcome, no matter how good VR gets, he said. Thirdly, he advocates for stillness, silence, and focus, which every church ever is currently talking about if you're familiar with spiritual formation conversations. Fourth, he tells us to practice transcendence of self. He goes on to suggest how to do this. I don't fully agree with all of his practical applications, as he includes taking psychedelic drugs and things like that. I don't personally understand how he sees this as transcendence because it's still all about personal experience with self. For Christians, we transcend ourselves through service to our spiritual brothers and sisters and hospitality to our neighbor. And so that's the way it translates to me. Fifth, Haidt tells us to be quick to forgive and slow to become angry. Sound like anyone you know? He gives Jesus the credit for this quote and then goes on to quote much more of the Sermon on the Mount. He obviously subscribes to Jesus as a moral teacher, but he himself is an atheist. It's key here, though, to note that Haidt draws a juxtaposition to social media when he's talking about the teachings of Jesus. Social media is the opposite of being quick to forgive and slow to become angry. He says it trains us to make rapid judgments with little concern for the humanity of those we criticize, think cancel culture, no knowledge of the context in which they acted, and no awareness that we have often done the very thing for which we are shaming them. Lastly, he argues all to practice being in nature and cultivating the discipline of being in awe. As he explained the neuroscientific and biological connections to being in nature as correlative to decreasing depression and anxiety, I could not help but hear Jesus say, "Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow, nor reap, nor gather in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to the span of his life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field and how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Many of you who are watching this are most likely Christians as well, because you're my friends, family, and I really don't want you to miss this super hopeful point here if you are. Haidt's proverbial antidote to a society marred and deformed by social media is everything that belief in Jesus and being connected to his church offers. I hope this invigorates your passion to share the gospel and get excited about the work that you're doing in your local church or in your family around your dinner table at home. Number 9, the greatest thing we can do is remove fear from our parenting and replace it with trust in the natural process of childhood. This is a really personal takeaway for me. Haidt puts disclaimers all throughout the book that there's no one perfect approach for every parent and that everyone will have to do what's best. All he desires to show us is that if we are looking at data and what is generally bad and good for children in their maturation process, we can and should look to it for guidance. On the topic of overparenting in the real world, I appreciate the reminder that we shouldn't blame parents for being helicopters. We should blame and change a culture that tells parents that they must helicopter. I have never realized how cultural hysteria mixed with my personal experience had made me a fearful parent regarding my children's safety as the highest value. And it's not that it's not a value, but I don't want to place it as the highest value. In this section, Haidt references a book called The Gardener and the Carpenter, which underlines a modern definition of successful parenting that potentially misses the mark. This definition says, if I can just find the right training, I can do the job well, I'll produce the superior product. This thinking is in line with carpentry, a calculated profession where the end goal is youthfulness to be judged against clear standards. In this book that Haidt is referencing, the author, Alison Gopnik, says that a better way to think about rearing a child is as a gardener. Your job is to create a protected and nurturing space for plants to flourish. It takes some work, but you don't have to be a perfectionist. Weed the garden, water it, and then step back and the plants will do their thing, unpredictably, and often with delightful surprises. Haidt says, Gopnik urges us to embrace the messiness and unpredictability of raising children. This leads me to one of my biggest, most actionable takeaways from this book, which is that, number 10, 2 of the greatest soil enhancers that I want to give my kids in their childhood are risky play and gradual age-appropriate independence. If you follow Haidt on social media, which feels like an ironic way to open this sentence, you'll see a lot more content surrounding his support for promoting independence within childhood. This looks like to him bringing back neighborhood biking, roaming, letting kids do things on their own, allowing them to play roughly even if it means they get hurt, and minimizing adult intervention among children's play spaces. This definitely feels scary, but freeing, and I personally want to take this step even when this feels like a scary but freeing step that I personally want to take. I know that when I do try age-appropriate versions of this at home, I always see the benefits it brings in giving my boys confidence in their own ability. In the book, Haidt concedes that most parents agree that children need to become progressively independent, but we all lack a guiding scale of when they can become independent and in what ways. He reminds us that a child doesn't morph into a culturally functional adult solely through biological maturation. So, he suggests a standard and secular solution for the United States to consider as rites of passage throughout childhood. He proposes age 6 as the age of family responsibility, age 8 as the age of local freedom, age 10 as the age of roaming, age 12 as the age of apprenticeship, age 14 as the age of high school and minimal age to get the first smartphone, age 16 age of driving and major milestone in which they can enter social media as a minimum age 18 age of legal adulthood and separation from childhood, and lastly age 21 full legal adulthood. The general takeaway from me here, and that he even suggests, is even more than exact ages and all of us doing the same thing, is seeing each birthday or biological milestone as an opportunity for a new independence milestone and initiation into older maturation. I think seeing parenting this way is more palatable than, 1, the overwhelming thought of not giving any independence only to throw them out in the world at 18, or 2, giving away too much independence at the wrong time and not protecting them on the age-appropriate level. I think many of us have been on either one of those scales. I think he really proposes a good middle ground for slowly helping them become independent, sometimes more independent than we think they should be, but nonetheless, the goal is that we are truly helping them mature and aiding them into getting into the right soil to grow. This conversation about rites and passages in the age of responsibility have already brought such a creative discussion to Ethan and I on how we're going to hand off responsibility to our boys and entrust them with things in order to see them flourish that we are really excited about. Well, those are my takeaways. Thank you so much for watching this. I do highly recommend that you read the book, especially if you're a parent or work with children. There is so much great content here that I really only lightly summarized, and I added a lot of my personal opinion and perspective. It could prove powerful if you took the information in through your own perspective and see if different sections of the book stand out to you. You can also follow Dr. Jonathan Haidt on social media, where he posts clips to various podcasts and posts about these concepts so that you can get very familiar with his core ideas. But if you enjoyed my perspective and getting new read recommendations, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and come back here to see other videos I post about what I'm reading. And thank you for watching this and just letting me share the passion I have for learning from others and being a force of change in this beautiful world that God made and seeing people reconciled to Christ, which is just our number one goal of being here. So see you guys, and hope this was helpful.